At minus 50 degrees, the human body has roughly 90 minutes before the organs start negotiations about quitting. Blood thickens, muscles stop responding. The brain, starved of warm circulation, starts making decisions that feel logical and are actually fatal. Soviet soldiers knew all of this, and they slept outside anyway, every single night, all winter long. In this video, you'll learn exactly what they knew, how they hacked their own metabolism for warmth, how they read snow like a building material, and why the simple act of eating the right thing at the right time was worth more than any piece of gear their commanders could have issued them. Here's the thing about dirt. Every survival expert talks about fire, food, and water. Nobody talks about dirt. Soviet soldiers understood something ancient that modern survival training mostly ignores. On the ground itself is a heater. 3 feet below the surface, even in Russia's most brutal winter, the Earth maintains a temperature around 32 to 40 degrees. Not warm exactly, but not minus 50 degrees either. That gap is the difference between alive and dead. So they dug. Not foxholes, not trenches. Actual underground rooms called zemlyankas. A basic zemlyanka was roughly the size of a one-car garage, dug 4 feet down, roofed with logs and dirt. Sounds simple. It absolutely was. And that simplicity is exactly why it worked. Construction required nothing that wasn't already under their feet. No supply chain, no requisition forms, no waiting for command approval, just entrenching tools and the will to use them. A properly built zemlyanka with 4 soldiers inside maintained an interior temperature 40 to 60 degrees warmer than the surface, not from fire, and not from equipment, just trapped earth warmth and body heat doing math together. Some units dug full villages underground, entire command posts, medical stations, even field kitchens, all invisible from the air, all heated by the planet itself. Sounds like primitive engineering, right? The Germans thought so too, right up until they started dying in their canvas tents, while Soviet soldiers were sleeping in heated underground rooms they'd built in an afternoon. But zemlyankas required time you didn't always have. When the front moved, when orders changed, when you had 30 minutes before artillery started again, you needed something faster. That's where the overcoat strategy changed everything. Here's the thing about the Soviet military overcoat. The Chanel wasn't designed to be worn, not entirely. Man, it was designed to be lived in. Weighing roughly 7 pounds and cut to ankle length, most Western observers thought it was clumsy, outdated, almost comically old-fashioned compared to German winter gear. Those observers were mostly making that judgment from warm offices. A single Chanel, wrapped correctly and worn with the collar turned up and secured, created dead air pockets across the entire torso. Dead air, same principle that makes double-pane windows work. Moving air steals heat. Trapped air locks it in. Soviet soldiers had been wearing this technology for over a century before the Germans invented synthetic insulation. Tradition accidentally became engineering. But here's where it gets genuinely clever. In groups of 4 or more, soldiers didn't wear their coats to sleep. They combined them. 2 coats laid flat. Now 2 more laid on top. 4 men squeezed underneath like a human sandwich. Each body generating roughly 80 watts of heat. 4 bodies producing 320 watts inside a sealed wool envelope. Do the math. That's a small electric space heater worth of warmth, generated entirely by human metabolism, requiring 0 fuel. They called this bundling. Sounds like something from a frontier folk story. It worked like something from an engineering textbook. German soldiers in better insulated individual sleeping bags, sleeping alone, were losing to the laws of thermodynamics one by one. Soviet soldiers were pooling resources against the same enemy. Different philosophy, very different outcome. Sounds simple, right? Almost embarrassingly simple. But here's what nobody mentions. It only works if you stay dry. And staying dry at minus 50 degrees is its own separate war. Here's the thing nobody talks about when they describe Soviet winter survival. Frostbite didn't come from the cold directly. It came from moisture first. Sweat inside a boot, breath condensation inside a collar, a thin layer of moisture that turned into ice crystals against skin, destroying tissue cell by cell. German soldiers with technically superior boots lost more men to frostbite than Soviet soldiers wearing felt Valenki that looked like something a grandmother would knit. Why? Because Soviet soldiers greased everything. Animal fat, most commonly lard, was applied directly to exposed skin every single morning. Face, neck, wrists, anything that might see wind. It wasn't moisturizer, it was a vapor barrier. No, a thin film of fat stops moisture from forming against skin in the same way a waxed jacket sheds rain. Primitive? Absolutely. Chemically sophisticated? Also, yes. Valenki, those thick felt boots that German officers described as laughably crude, worked on the same principle. Felt doesn't compress under pressure the way leather does. It maintains air pockets. It doesn't conduct cold the way rigid materials do. And critically, Soviet soldiers knew never to wear them tight. A loose boot traps warm air. A tight boot cuts circulation and turns your feet into frostbite candidates regardless of what you're wearing. German quartermasters issued hobnailed leather boots designed for the Western European climate they expected the war to stay in. They were excellent boots for a different war. Soviet soldiers wore gear calibrated over generations for exactly this environment. That calibration was worth more than any technological advantage. But even perfect gear, perfect technique, perfect insulation fails at one specific moment. Around 3 to 4 a.m., when the temperature dropped to its absolute floor. That's when soldiers who survived everything else stopped coming back. And what happened in those hours? That's where the real strategy lived. Here's the thing about extreme cold. It doesn't peak at midnight. It waits. The coldest temperatures on the Eastern Front, some nights hitting minus 54 degrees, arrived in the hours just before dawn. Soldiers who had managed every other challenge, who were warm at midnight, dry at 1 a.m., well-fed and insulated at 2 a.m., sometimes simply didn't wake up at 5 a.m. Not from enemy action, from physics. Experienced Soviet soldiers refused to sleep through this window undisturbed. Veterans woke each other on rotation. Every unit had a designated watch, not primarily for enemy reconnaissance, but for hypothermia monitoring. A man who stopped shivering in his sleep wasn't warming up, he was shutting down. The shivering reflex is your body fighting. When the fight stops, the body is losing. The monitoring protocol was simple. Shake the man beside you every 90 minutes during peak cold hours. Make him respond. Make him move. Movement restarts circulation. Circulation restarts heat generation. 90 seconds of activity could restart a metabolism that was quietly beginning to fail. It cost almost nothing. It saved lives at a rate that military medical records from the period document clearly. Veterans also timed their last meal deliberately. Heavy rations, particularly those highest in fat content, eaten 60 to 90 minutes before peak cold hours. Digesting fat generates more body heat than any other metabolic process. Soviet field rations, often criticized by Western analysts as calorie-dense and unrefined, were accidentally perfectly calibrated for thermogenesis. Lard, black bread, salted fish. Not gourmet, metabolically optimal. Some units even developed the practice of synchronized sleep and synchronized waking. Everybody down at the same time. Everybody up at the same time. Shared schedules prevented the situation where one man was alert and 3 were dangerously deep in sleep during the killing window. Communal survival, enforced by culture and necessity in equal measure. Here's the thing about snow. Every instinct you have about it is wrong. It looks cold. It feels cold. It is cold. And yet Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front deliberately buried themselves in it to survive the night. Not as a last resort, as a strategy, a preferred one. Snow is roughly 90 to 95% trapped air. Same principle as the Chanel bundling. Same principle as layered blankets. Same physics, different material. A properly constructed snow shelter, what veterans called a snezhnaya yama, literally a snow pit, maintains an interior temperature hovering right around 32 degrees. That sounds terrible until you remember what's happening outside. When the ambient temperature is minus 50 degrees, a snow shelter isn't cold. It's 82 degrees warmer than the alternative. That gap is everything. Construction took roughly 20 minutes with an entrenching tool. Dig down 4 feet, cut a sleeping ledge above the floor level, pack the walls tight. I poke a single ventilation hole with a rifle barrel. The sleeping ledge matters more than it sounds. Cold air is heavy. It sinks and pools at the lowest point. By sleeping above the floor, you're staying out of the coldest pocket in the shelter. Simple geometry keeping you alive. German soldiers who stumbled across these snow pits thought they were looking at graves. In a way, they were right, just not the way they meant. Sounds suicidal, right? Deliberately covering yourself in frozen water when you're already fighting hypothermia. Here's what changes the calculation completely. Wind chill is the actual killer at extreme temperatures. At minus 50 degrees, with even a 15-mile-per-hour wind, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Inside a snow shelter, wind chill drops to effectively zero. You've just neutralized the most dangerous variable on the battlefield without a single piece of equipment. Soviet soldiers also understood something about snow that took Western survival science decades to formally document. Fresh powder snow insulates at roughly the same rate as fiberglass insulation. Not as well, but the same category. Packed snow is denser and conducts cold faster. So experienced soldiers specifically sought out undisturbed powder fields. Not packed drifts, not ice. Fresh snow that still held its air pockets intact. They were reading snow like a material engineer reads construction materials. Some units developed a rotation specifically for snow shelters during mobile operations. First man digs, second man improves, third man sleeps, fourth man watches. By the time the unit needed to move again, 3 men had rotated through genuine sleep in a structure that cost nothing to build and left no thermal signature visible to enemy aircraft. No fire, no smoke, no heat bloom. Just soldiers who had temporarily become part of the landscape. But here's the detail that separates the veterans from the men on their first winter campaign. Moisture management inside snow shelters followed exactly the same rules as everywhere else. You dug in wearing dry clothes, you removed your outer layer before sleeping to prevent sweat accumulation during the warmer hours inside. You never, under any circumstances, let your core temperature rise high enough to cause sweating inside the shelter. Because wet clothing in a snow shelter at minus 50 degrees doesn't dry, it freezes. And a man who wakes up wearing frozen clothes has lost every advantage the shelter gave him in a single night. The veterans called this discipline Shuba Disciplina, coat discipline, knowing precisely when to add a layer and when to remove one. Getting warm, slowly and deliberately, never fast. Fast warmth meant sweat. Sweat meant moisture. Moisture at minus 50 degrees meant the cold had found its way inside your last defense. The Germans tried to implement snow shelter construction after the first catastrophic winter. Their training manuals from 1942 describe the technique in reasonable detail, but technique written in a manual and technique passed between veterans who learned it from men who survived Russian winters before there was a war to fight. Those are two entirely different things. One is information. The other is knowledge. The Eastern Front, more than almost any conflict in military history, was decided by that difference. Here's the thing about the Eastern Front that history usually frames as ideology or geography. It was also a masterclass in who understood the enemy they were actually fighting. The Germans came prepared for a short campaign in familiar European conditions. They were catastrophically right about their military strategy and catastrophically wrong about their enemy's environment. Soviet soldiers weren't tougher because of propaganda. They were more effective because the knowledge they carried was generational. A Russian soldier in 1942 grew up in the same climate. His grandfather survived it. His father survived it. The specific techniques, the Zemlyankas, the Chanel bundling, the lard applications, the 3 a.m. and awake rotations. None of that came from a military manual. It came from living in a country that had been solving this problem every winter for centuries. The German Wehrmacht issued updated cold weather guidance in late 1941 after catastrophic casualties to exposure. Soviet soldiers had been following their version of that guidance since childhood. What we're looking at isn't just military history. It's proof that the most sophisticated survival technology isn't always the most expensive or the most modern. Sometimes it's the knowledge your grandmother had, multiplied across an army, applied with discipline during the coldest hours of the longest nights. They survived minus 50 degrees with felt boots, animal fat, a wool coat, and each other. The simplest weapons sometimes win the longest wars.